Okay, welcome to another lecture. This lecture is about the Civil War. Just as a reminder, the unit is Unit 4, Period 5. Cool. Okay, so the Civil War, we know, starts with slavery, but there's different parts to it, and I'm going to start with some regional differences in the North, which eventually is the Union, right around here, and the South. So the North was industry, and the South is agriculture. And you can see here, as far as the population for those within trade and manufacturing, extremely large up here. Oops, sorry, let me go back. There we go. Okay. Within Congress, there were a lot of fights between Northern and Southern representatives because they're trying to appease the industry that they're in, right? So Northern representatives against slavery, easy to say because you have industry, you have immigration, you have all that fun stuff. Down here, for slavery. During this time, there were famously beatings and fights, like actual fist fights within Congress, over slavery, over negotiation, and over industrial differences. Cool. Also, before the Civil War, you have various abolitionist movements. You also have something where a lot of abolitionists were trying to publish literature to show how evil slavery was. This is one of the most famous ones. Uncle Tom's Cabin was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe after she was upset about the Fugitive Slave Act being passed. She wanted to recruit more abolitionists and those who believed slavery had to be ended, so she published this book. And that did the trick. There were a lot more people going onto the abolitionist side, but it also fueled Southern resentment towards abolitionists. You also had a lot of politicians going around and having debates about slavery and abolition. The most famous was Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas. They were debating to become senator of Illinois. And the various debates with Stephen Douglas came about. They would go all around. They talked about Dred Scott, the ideas of territory, getting rid of slavery, and Abraham Lincoln argued that it was on the federal government to change things. Essentially, though, Stephen Douglas won, and Lincoln kind of had to wait till he ran for president, which he did in the election of 1860. So the Republican Party, the front runner is Abraham Lincoln. For the Democrats, the front runner was Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas was assumed, though, to not be radical enough to protect slavery, and Southern states warned that if the election of Lincoln would split the Union, which kind of makes sense why they said that. I mean, obviously they're being a V dramatic, but still look. Lincoln won all of these northern states. All of these southern states go to this dude. Douglas just won Missouri, poor buddy, and then we have Bell. So, not ideal, right? This shows the separation between northern and southern states on slavery and other ideas. After the election of 1860, there was a fear of secession or of southern states leaving. And a way to try to appease southern states, the Curtidian amendments were brought up. The idea is that the Missouri Compromise comes back into play. All of these slave states have rights as slave states. And if states, let's say, for example, Kentucky the people decided to abolish slavery, slave owners could still have rights there. Abraham Lincoln, who was going to be the incoming president, did not support this, and these amendments sort of kind of fell flat because a lot of northern states thought it was appeasing slave states too much. So, we have the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln. He was assumed to be more radical since he stated he wanted slavery abolished. Nonetheless, he wasn't a fan of full emancipation and often supported ideas such as freed slaves going back to Africa instead of integrating them into American society, and was kind of weary of extending the right to vote to freed slaves. Nonetheless, when Lincoln was elected in 1860, it was the final straw for a lot of southern states. They were worried about states' rights and that the federal government would take away their right to slavery. So within 3 months of Abraham Lincoln's election, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas all seceded from the Union and said they were no longer part of the United States. They would be part of the Confederate States of America. So this is essentially what starts the Civil War. Do states have the right to secede or not? The first shots of the Civil War were at Fort Sumter. So Lincoln took office in 1861. Confederate forces, or the seceded states, started to try to take over Fort Sumter in South Carolina. So Federal forces and Union forces fought together there. The Union forces lost, and Confederate forces won Fort Sumter. After this, 4 more southern states seceded: Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. Border states like Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri still stayed within the Union, but they still had slavery, and the Union still let them have slavery. So we have the Civil War where you have the Union versus the Confederacy. The advantages of the Union, before I get into the advantages, it's important that we understand what the Civil War was over. Yes, it is over slavery, but more importantly, the Union argues that they are allowed to go to war with another country, essentially the Confederate States, because it is illegal for states to secede. So the Union is saying we have the right to preserve the Union and go to war with Confederate States. Confederate States argued the other. They said that it is the right of states to leave a government if they want to, which they wanted to. So now let's get into some of the logistics of the war. So the Union, it seems like, would win, right? They have more people, they already have a government, they have industry and railroads. However, the Confederacy had more experience, military experience. They also had a government, and they had a stronger cause and reason to fight. So this war was not an easy war for the Union to eventually win. The Civil War was one of the bloodiest battles ever, with around 620,000 men losing their lives, and probably even more losing their lives due to the military war effort. And I just want to show you a comparison here. You can see how many people died in Civil War Americans. The next one is World War II, but still not even close to the Civil War. And a lot of our assumptions of wars and how bad they are is nothing compared to what the Civil War was like. So it was a very bloody war. All right. So the Union was losing quite a bit of battles. So Abraham Lincoln was a bit worried that, oh dang, we're going to lose the Civil War. We're going to lose these states. So one of his as a chief of the military, right, one of his war strategies was the Emancipation Proclamation. It's essentially an executive order that all slaves in Confederate states are freed. Interesting, right? Because, one, technically Abraham Lincoln is not the president of Confederate states, so how can he ensure that Confederate states are free? Also, an executive order can be overturned by the next president. So as far as legal standing, this has no basis to it. But it was an important war effort to convince slaves and others to be a part of the movement for the Civil War. It did not affect slaves, though, in Union states that still had slaves, such as Missouri and Kentucky. Oh, I have someone interrupting me. Here, 1 second, just leave it out there. Great, okay. So, end of the war. After about 4 years with the bloodiest war, the Union eventually out-strategized the Confederacy, which is why Confederate states are, again, part of the United States today. Forces overtook Confederate strongholds, and the surrender was on April 9th. The war was over, but the question of getting states readmitted to the Union was tricky. So the next 2 class lessons will be, 1, about the lack of compromise leading up to the Civil War, and then 2, what sort of actions were taken in the Civil War as president and as the federal government. And then next week, we'll talk more, or the week after, about Reconstruction. Hope you enjoyed the lecture. See y'all later.